And welcome to this week's edition of Making Sense. It's an important one. We have budget speech coming up next week. Of course, that will be where the money is going to come from with all the promises made during SONA 2026 and then the debate and then the reply, of course. But very interestingly, when it comes to the budget speech, we don't live in a bubble. We live in a global economy and we are going to feel the impacts of global changes, whether that be economical, geopolitical, etc. I want to bring in someone who knows all too much about this when you bring in all those different spheres. Chris Hattingh, Executive Director of the Centre for Risk Analysis, joining us on the podcast this week. Chris, and good to have you on the show, by the way. Incredible article that you've written, and it's not just an opinion piece, which obviously you weigh into quite nicely, but you also do incredible data research at CRA, and even this research this year. Very good title. Tell me about it.
Thanks very much, Gareth, and thank you for having me on the show. Really appreciate all the work that you guys are doing and the opportunity to contribute. So keep in mind with the CRA, I mean, we've been around in one form or another since the 1950s, and we collect data on South Africa in different formats. We publish every year the Socioeconomic Survey of South Africa, which contains 14 chapters on the economy, healthcare, education, society, demographics, all that kind of thing. We use that data to then build our op-eds, our research, our short-form briefings for businesses, that kind of thing. So in this particular article, I wanted to look at the state of things at the moment in terms of our possible economic turnaround. So is the hype justified? Over the last 12 months, we've seen very positive headlines.
It has been great. I mean, gold has been looking good. The rand has been doing very, very well.
We're off the grey list.
We're off the grey list.
Yes,
so are we getting too excited about this, or is there a bubble that's going to burst?
Yeah, so I think there's a risk of getting a bit too excited because of things like the gold and commodity cycle and the upswing there, which has been helped a lot by President Trump and his administration's moves in the White House. So when the dollar is seen as more risky, you look for safe havens like commodities, for example. And South Africa benefits always from commodity upswings. I don't want to discount the work that has been done by the GNU, especially on the financial fiscal side. So if you look at things like being removed from the grey list, that's not a bubble. That happens through hard work by Treasury, by the NPA, by other institutions supporting those sort of financial institutions on government side. However, if you look at the growth picture, we can't just rely on a commodity cycle. That helps your mining, it helps automotive, it helps manufacturing a bit, but it doesn't help your construction necessarily or your heavy industry. It doesn't necessarily help your education, your healthcare sectors in terms of job creation. So we want to see bigger, wider growth across many sectors. This year, we might get 1.4% growth. That triples our growth rate from 2024. So to give credit to that and the work being done, but also to say we need above 2% growth to match.
It's better,
yes,
but it's not where it should be as well, because the strategic intelligence briefing that you're talking about here, I love the title because I think it nails it so nicely, is the pulse of the nation. Now, if I'm going to stick with the analogy of a pulse, how do we triage our economy when it comes to budget speech next week, for example? Because you also talk about the risks, which we can unpack, if you wouldn't mind, but also knowing those risks, there must be opportunities as well, aren't there?
No, 100%. That's always the case in South Africa as well. I think with higher risk and uncertainty comes more opportunity. And if you compare us to other emerging markets and even developing markets, like developed markets like the US, the Europe, China, those places are encountering serious growth challenges at the moment. China facing a demographic challenge from population growth, the US from uncertainty around fiscal policy, the independence of the Fed. Europe also with a population decline and also the risk of continued conflict with Russia, for example. If you compare South Africa to that, we've got a lot of fundamentals that are quite strong if we get some of our basics right. So your things like crime, your logistics, your electricity supply. So to talk a bit about the strategic intelligence briefing and the pulse of the nation, I think if you look at our sort of scenario set for South Africa, we're kind of at the moment in the recovery ward. So South Africa at the moment, some of the bleeding has been stemmed, right, and some of the good work is being done, as I mentioned, especially on the fiscal side. Our debt situation, for example, in the budget, we're forecasting and expected that our debt to GDP ratio will peak, which means if it peaks, you've got more capacity to spend on productive infrastructure, on the kinds of things that citizens need. You've got more fiscal room to breathe. However, given all of that, we don't yet see the South African patient, as it were, in a position to run a marathon or to do the Ironman kind of thing. We're not that strong yet. We're building up to that. The question is, can we push through the kind of basic reforms that we still need before we get to the things like the fourth or fifth industrial revolution, the bullet trains, some of the things that President Ramaphosa talked about in his SONA. I should mention just on the SONA, I was fortunate enough to attend in person. And I was with the president for at least the first half of it because there was a sense of honesty, right? So if you go and see your physician, your doctor, even if they give you bad news, you appreciate the bad news because there's honesty. They're like, this is the issues we need to solve. How do we do this?
And there's a plan.
Yes.
Did you get a sense, just speaking of SONA, did you get a sense there was a plan? We can talk budget in a moment.
Sure.
Lots of promises, but any of them sound implementable in a perfect world?
In a perfect world, yes. If you look on the crime side, I understand the desire to deploy the SANDF to assist the police. We know crime is probably the biggest issue that continues to afflict millions of South Africans on a day-to-day basis. Those of us who are fortunate enough to afford private security, we can do so, but many citizens try and rely on the SAPs, and they can't do so. The risk is that you deploy the SANDF, which is trained for conflict. That's their first sort of reaction, is someone shoots at them and they shoot back kind of thing. So not trained as the SAPs are necessarily. So I guess the risk is here that there is a plan by the president and his cabinet ministers and colleagues, but at times it risks being a bit of a laundry list. So he continued listing things for about an hour and a half, 2 hours. And I thought eventually maybe you should just focus on some key priorities. Even in an election year, if one wants to be cynical, you can say, these are top 10 priorities by government. It's an election year, but there's also the priorities that would capacitate more economic activity.
And what is different about this election year, this local government election coming up? It's going to be the first one we're going to have since the formation of the Government of National Unity. So the critics in years gone by would say, well, there's only one party in charge. They can make all the promises they want to, and nobody can really hold them accountable if they get it wrong. It's a different picture this time around because now it is more collaborative. And if the ANC gets it wrong, it makes the GNU members look bad. So everyone's going to start perhaps paddling in the same direction, I would imagine.
I think so. And part of that, and to add further credence to that analysis, is afterwards, and I haven't sort of seen every piece of coverage after the SONA, but of all the GNU partners and participants, I didn't see any strident criticism or concern about the SONA, as there would have been before from parties who were in opposition and are now in the GNU.
Part of the club.
Yes, right. Yeah. So there is a bit of a risk of sort of co-opting, and usually the narrative is around the DA, but other parties as well. So because you're in now, do you still push such strident criticism or not? Maybe we'll see that emerging later in the year as we head towards the election.
The politicking ahead of the local government elections, you start seeing the billboards coming up. Of all of the issues that can be discussed, whether it is crime, whether it is economic stability, fiscal frameworks, it still comes down to the number of unemployed youth. Earlier this week, we saw the Labour quarterly survey coming out, and the unemployment, especially for the youth, is just still far too high, and there's just no opportunities for these youngsters. That's still the key issue for me.
Yeah, and it sort of continues to bubble under, right? So some people there might be a sense of hopelessness, so then you just decide not to try and look for work anymore. You also possibly decide not to vote. And we've seen the voter participation figure declining since our very first democratic election. Since then, the figure has been declining in every national election. Your local elections also generally see lower voter turnout, so I expect that to continue. But on the youth unemployment side, it's one thing for the official rate to tick down slightly, but if your majority of citizens who are younger don't feel they've got economic opportunities, what do they pursue eventually? To vent that energy and that sense of agency and dignity, do they pursue other means of trying to change things in the world? Do you see a rise of some populist politics then? Possibly so. We've been fortunate that we haven't yet had that to a serious level as other countries have had, but it remains underlying. So the little bit of growth momentum we've seen over the last 12 to 18 months, that really has to be sustained and increased even further. Then it lends credence to the fact that things might be changing. And it also helps boost this idea of sort of democratic centralism, so that you've got this idea of being in government does change some things. Yes, it takes time, but it does change things. And that you've got political parties broadly in the GNU with all sorts of caveats, but that support the constitution and the idea of democratic participation.
Participation, I think a lot of people are going to look at that as to the promises made at SONA. And I want to just talk, your crystal ball is always very accurate. You keep it charged up these days for us. It's the budget speech coming up next week. So those promises we mentioned, now someone has to pick up the bills. Someone's got to pay the tab for all of this. And it's not just the money, but on the electoral participation, I would imagine that if we can get a concrete plan for many of the issues raised in SONA and get the financial backing, maybe people might feel, well, let me go and vote, because this might be the time things turn around. What's your prediction for budget speech?
Yeah, it's sort of a virtuous cycle. So that's, that idea of if you participate and things change, it feeds on itself, even if it takes a longer period of time. On the budget, I don't foresee any massive changes. I foresee continuation being the key takeaway, which again, given our last 15 years trajectory, is a positive sign. So it sets us apart from other emerging markets and from other developed markets like the US and the Fed independence question. You will probably continue to see support for things like the SRD grant and other forms of social relief and welfare, which I think plays a vital role in our South African context. It shouldn't be the first port of call, but it still plays a very important role. My biggest hope is some kind of bigger commitment and clear implementation timelines for infrastructure investment. So, and the very basics, again, I know it's not sexy, but just water infrastructure, pipes maintenance, that kind of thing. We've seen Johannesburg, almost 50% of water lost to leaks. If you can just fix some of those basics, you don't have to worry about building new reservoirs or dams. Yes, that'd be great, and I want that, but let's just focus on the basics. So I'm hoping that you'll see that. I don't foresee a kind of fallout like last year, and based on how the SONA was delivered and the reaction to the SONA, the parties in the GNU, I don't foresee a massive fallout. Let's see exactly how Treasury then implements the SONA. The SONA captures the headlines. The budget always is about where government's priorities are in terms of spending. So let's see if they continue the fiscal responsibility path. If they do, that leads to more credit upgrades. It leads to lower debt costs for government, which in turn means they can spend more on the necessary things. And it boosts investor and market sentiment, which in turn boosts the strength of the rand.
And you best believe his crystal ball is often right. Chris Hattingh, thank you very much for joining us on Making Sense. So we're all looking ahead to budget speech, see where that money is going to be coming from. I wanted to speak to Chris to understand the international ramifications, the risks for us, the opportunities for us, what was said at SONA, and where that money is going to come from to implement that in, as he says, a very important year when it comes to local government elections. All of that, you can't separate it, but it's important to make sense of it. Chris Hattingh is the Executive Director from the Centre for Risk Analysis, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.